It marked a symbolic end to one of the most defining geopolitical tensions of the late 20th century. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War era. Now, there's no shortage of books, essay, analysis pieces, or documentaries on that historic turning point, but perhaps what's been missing is a more humanized account of how East Germans themselves experienced the rise and fall of the German Democratic Republic. Well, historian and journalist Katja Hoyer's forthcoming book, Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990, offers just that. She joins us now on Perspective. Katja, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Morning, thank you.
So how does your approach in writing this book differ from others in exploring the history and legacy of East Germany?
Well, whilst I've written this book as a historian, I was also born in East Germany. So what I was trying to do is also tell the story of the 6 million East Germans, 16 million East Germans that lived there. And so I'm trying to sort of flip the perspective around. It's not about looking on from the West, but it's actually telling the story from the perspectives of the people that lived there.
So you were born there. I understand that you were very young when it collapsed. Do you have any personal memories of that period, if nothing else, but through your family members?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, you sort of grow up between people that were shaped by the state. So, your parents, your teachers, your neighbors, the people around you are all kind of a product, if you will, of the state. So even if most of your childhood is after 1990, you're still kind of surrounded by people who experienced the GDR. But I do have a very early memory of being in Berlin in 1989 when the demonstrations gathered. So this was about to sort of all kick off and change the world around me forever. And I was right in the middle of it on the last day of the Republic on the 7th of October 1989 on a day out. And I remember kind of the sense of excitement, anxiety, something big was about to happen.
So you said that you wanted to go beyond the usual stories about East Germany in writing this book. What are some of the cliches or misconceptions that you wanted to deconstruct?
Well, for one thing, the picture is very monochrome, it's very one-sided. So you have sort of this idea that East Germans were locked behind the wall for 41 years and didn't do very much until they were liberated in 1989. And I wanted to show that, first of all, this is a very long time span, so things did happen. But of course, people lived their lives. They weren't a grey mass of people that, were kind of just victims, but they actually got on with their lives. They got married, they studied, they worked, they went on holiday, they made jokes about their politicians. They were real people. And it was important to me, or it still is important to me, to show that actually meaningful lives were led behind the Iron Curtain rather than kind of just having this drab mass of faceless victims of communism there.
So we often talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall as a form of liberation for East Germans. But what are some of the things that they lost? I found it fascinating to see in your book some of the information about the child care system, employment for women, which was much better than elsewhere in the region at the time. What are some of the other things that people lost with the fall of the German Democratic Republic?
Well, it depends a bit on who you were. I mean, lots of identities were sort of gained and lost when the wall fell. Most people, I think, as I just said, led a kind of normal life, and it's more the degree of change, what happened afterwards, that was really disconcerting to lots of people. So if you grow up in a socialist system, your job's secure, you have, as you just said, you've got childcare, you've got education, sort of paid for by the state. All of these things are there, and for the people that lived within the state rather than sort of against it, for the people that weren't opposition people, that was a secure world that they kind of knew where they stood in and what happened to them. Whilst, of course, a sort of capitalist system, the system that they entered, democracy, ends up with more opportunities, but also with more risks. There's a very real chance that your job might be gone tomorrow, as was the case for lots of East Germans. A fifth of them were unemployed by the early 2000s. And these were all experiences that people weren't used to, didn't know that they existed, because they'd kind of viewed the West through the window of consumerism, through Western TV, Western radio, and it didn't really give a kind of clear sense of the risks that are attached with living in a sort of market economy at the same time.
Given those risks that you described there, then do you think that it was a relatively smooth process then of unifying those two Germanys?
Well, it was very quick. So that was one of the things that East Germans voted for when the first free elections happened, was for parties that advocated for a very quick and very one-sided unification process, whereby basically the GDR, East Germany, became part of the system that West Germany had set up, rather than merging the two together. And this process meant that, for instance, nationalized businesses were very quickly dissolved, and often under dubious circumstances. It also meant that there was no time at all for any kind of cultural adjustment, and no investment in that. It was just assumed that because East Germans had contributed to bringing the wall down and had then voted to reunify with the West under their system, that they would kind of seamlessly, needlessly fit into that system. And that, I think, is the legacy that we still see today in a lot of kind of surveys and things that seem to imply that East Germans are still quite unhappy, many of them, with the situation.
That brings me to another question. Are there still, do you think, cultural divisions between East and West Germany that still exist today? What does that look like?
I think so. I mean, a lot of the social legacies of having set up a completely different society, we still see today. So, for example, my mother was only 22 when she had me, and that was kind of normal at the time. So you have kind of a whole generation, and even today still, kind of an ambition to become parents a lot younger than is the case with former West Germans. And therefore you have shorter generations. People often kind of know their great-grandparents, for example, still, because of the kind of short gaps between the generations. That leads to different parenting styles, different relationships between children and their parents. Mothers, so women in East Germany or in the former East Germany, are still more likely to work full-time because they've kind of seen that from their own mothers and grandmothers. So all of these things, if you take them together, they all may seem like little details, but if you take them together, you end up with quite a different way to sort of lead your life.
I found the anecdote in the preface about Angela Merkel having to minimize her East German identity very interesting. Do you think that there's a taboo or maybe even widespread indifference towards that part of German history that was kind of exemplified through that anecdote?
Well, Angela Merkel complained about it particularly because she started her political career basically straight when the Berlin Wall came down, and found it incredibly difficult then to talk about her East German past, because immediately once she did, criticism came up. Journalists were looking for incriminating details about her life in East Germany, and so she just learned to not talk about it. And that may be an extreme example, of course, given that she was at the helm of the country for 16 years. But it also applies to lots of other people in kind of, other roles, other positions. Many people went into what was West Germany to work, and they found that they were met with sort of stereotypes, anger, suspicion. There were kind of questions like, were you in the Stasi? Or, did you even have cars in East Germany? Like ridicule and suspicion. And people were keen, therefore, to often hide their East German past. So they acquired sort of like a standard German accent, so you couldn't really tell where they were from, and just didn't mention it. And this is a very, very widespread phenomenon, even today.
As a final question for you, Katja, and also kind of linked to that, how do you think the GDR more generally is remembered or even taught in schools in Germany today? Is it sufficiently a part of collective memory, both in the East and the West, in your view?
It is taught, and it is very much there in the conscious mind of all Germans, but only as a dictatorship. It's often referred to as the party dictatorship, which is of course correct. It was a dictatorship, but on the other side, there's no comprehension really how people lived, what their expectations were when the wall fell, and no ambition, it seems to me, either to try and get there, to try and create a little bit of empathy and understanding. And I think we could go a long way if we complicated and sort of moderated that history of the GDR a little bit, to broaden it out and to show the entire experience that people went through, rather than just focus on the dictatorship alone.
Katja Hoyer, author of Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990, which will be published tomorrow, April the 6th. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.